Hi, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Anisha Hardy, and I am the Executive Director for Alabama Values, and we are a proud partner in the Down for the Count Alabama Narrative Initiative. Down for the Count Alabama is a collaborative initiative that was launched over a year ago with partners like the Ordinary People Society, the Southern Leadership for Voter Engagement, and the Hispanic and Immigrant Center of Alabama. We all united around one mission, which was to increase the knowledge around ACS, the American Community Survey, and also census participation amongst underrepresented communities in Alabama and across the South. We are committed to providing clarity about the census process and really highlighting how census data impacts our daily lives by sharing accurate information and demystifying the process. We hope that we can ensure that every voice in Alabama is heard and every community is counted. Down for the Count Alabama was born from the understanding that our communities have some unique challenges and strengths that traditional outreach often misses. And so we hope to meet people where they are, sometimes literally on their front porch, to bring this message home. Our approach includes educational outreach, community storytelling, resources and tools, messaging research, and also partner collaboration. And through these efforts and through this narrative initiative, Down for the Count is really about empowering our communities to make sure that they're seen and heard. So this evening's conversation, why is this conversation important? Because decisions shaping the 2030 census, they are happening right now. Funding levels, Census Bureau staffing, questions are being debated. Misinformation, historical mistrust in communities that are often undercounted, political interference have already impacted past counts. In 2020, Alabama undercounted people. And that's not just a statistic, that's a resource loss of representation and power. And what are we seeing across the South that should push us to act sooner rather than later? That is the question that we are asking. And so I encourage us to look at these undercounts in Black, Hispanic, immigrant, and rural communities, propose rollbacks to protections. We see legislative attempts to limit who gets counted. We're also seeing a scale back on voting rights, the Voting Rights Act protections, which means accurate data is even more critical for the redistricting process. And this is about making the census personal. This is about making it local. This is not about government demands, but about what we need. And I often say they always count us out, but this is how we count ourselves in. The census is important. And we can't talk about counting without talking about power. Census data is the foundation for our democracy. It determines how voting districts are drawn and how much political power each community holds. And so when our people are undercounted, our neighborhoods can be packed into districts that dilute our vote or carved up in ways that really strip away our influence. And so an accurate census count is critical to fair maps, which is directly tied to who represents us and how our resources are distributed and whose voices are heard. So in this way, participating in the census isn't just about funding. It is about fighting for fair maps, fighting voting rights. It's about fighting for our voice to have power, especially in the face of ongoing voter suppression and attacks on democracy that we're seeing. I'm super excited to bring to the stage one of my dear partners and one of the collaborators with Down for the Count, Mitchell Brown. Mitchell's going to help us understand how laws and court decisions and disinformation campaigns are shaping public perceptions and participation in the census, and also what's at stake if we don't correct practices like prison gerrymandering.
So thanks so much, Anisha, for inviting me to the stage. Again, my name is Mitchell Brown. I'm from the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, where I'm senior counsel as well as the coordinator for the SOLVE Network, SOLVE standing for Southern Leadership for Voter Engagement. And I just wanted to give a couple of legal updates that I think people should know about that are going to be affected by how we carry out the census, as well as how courts are going to deal with redistricting and deal with things such as the citizenship question and how they're going to deal with challenges to redistricting in the future. So just to set the scene for folks, redistricting and the census are tied together, as Anisha said earlier. The census and the enumeration that comes from the census of calculating the populations of certain areas, certain geographies, are then used to apportion seats in Congress and to apportion seats in the state legislature, and even down to the local level on city councils, school boards, county commissions, soil and water conservation boards, etc., and how districts are drawn. So districts are drawn based on the total population of a state, of a county, and those from that enumeration, from that total population enumeration, districts are drawn if that the state or the locality uses districts. And so that's why it's very important for people to fill out the census, because those numbers are then used to, again, portion seats in Congress and also to draw the districts. And how the districts are drawn is based upon enumeration, because each district has to have a similar number of people in each district, and that there are different variances on the federal, state, and local level that I won't get into because that's a little deep in the weeds. But just generally, the district should be about the same size, and census data is used for that. But I'll go even further in ACS data and how the responses to the ACS and the projections from the ACS are very helpful, and noting where there may be increases or decreases in the representation of a state. And so filling out the ACS is also very important in helping prepare for the census fights and apportionment that is to come, because sadly, every time that there is a census and redistricting is done, there are always fights, especially in the South, and especially in ways that are racially discriminatory or based on partisanship, or based on having what's called malapportionment, where there's more people in one district than another. There's a whole lot of legal challenges that happen every time the census happens and redistricting is done. So a couple of cases just to set the scene again and go further, a little deeper, is right now voting rights are under attack. I think we all know that. I think that is something that is not news to us, but how these voter suppression and these laws are affecting redistricting is actually shocking. And shocking because it's taken us back to a time period where Black and brown folks did not have the right to vote, where there was violence, where there were attempts to depress the right to vote for minority voters, and especially in the redistricting context. Again, the census and redistricting are tied together. You can't have redistricting without having the census. And so because they're tied together, states are trying their best to consolidate power. And I was on a call previous, and one of the quotes that came to me always is, power concedes nothing without a demand. And I think right now we're in a space in our country where we have to demand equity and fairness in the drawing of maps, and equity and fairness in the right to vote. And we have to continue to push that demand forward. So right now in the redistricting context, there are a couple of ways that we can challenge maps. The first is under the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Another way is under the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution through what's known as racial gerrymandering. And there's also intentional discrimination. If a map is drawn to particularly and specifically discriminate against voters of color, we can bring intentional discrimination claims. And we can also bring what are known as malapportionment claims. Again, the districts have to be the same size. So if one district is above a certain deviation over another, then we're able to bring malapportionment claims. But what we've seen over the past couple of years is that the courts, both district appeals courts and now the Supreme Court, have tried to diminish the power for voters to bring Section 2 claims under the Voting Rights Act to challenge redistricting. There's a case out of Arkansas that found that there is no private right of action to challenge maps under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. What that means is that the only party that would be able to bring a lawsuit under Section 2, if the court agrees with this, the Supreme Court agrees with this, would be the United States Department of Justice. And they're not going to bring any lawsuits. They've brought very few over time. And so that's not a viable way to challenge these maps, because DOJ is just not going to do that. And that's regardless of who's in power. DOJ has not been the most active on the redistricting front. The next way that the courts are trying to diminish the ability to challenge redistricting is through conversation or a argument over whether party or race has taken precedence in the drawing of a map. So in South Carolina, there was a case where the state legislature moved 30,000 Black Democrats from one district to another in order to reach a certain racial quota in one of the congressional districts in South Carolina. And the South Carolina NAACP sued over that map, saying that this was intentionally discriminatory, but also was a racial gerrymander, because there was evidence that showed, again, the legislature moved 30,000 Black voters from one district to the other. And that went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court found that because they believed, should say, the state's reasoning that they didn't move the 30,000 voters because they were Black, but because they were Democrats, that was allowed under a partisan gerrymandering framework. And so this race and party overlap has become an issue that we have to deal with as advocates, and courts are siding with a partisan narrative that as long as the legislature says that they drew these maps for partisan reasons, they are able to draw whatever maps they want to. And so that's a problem. And then the last point that I'll address on the legal update front is just the ability to even bring intentional discrimination claims. And those claims usually require what are known as the direct evidence or circumstantial evidence. So if you have direct evidence that a map was drawn to particularly discriminate against Black or brown voters, then you can bring those claims. Or you can bring circumstantial evidence. You can look at the way the maps are drawn. They could have drawn it a different way, but they drew this map particularly for the reason to discriminate against Black or brown voters. The courts have made it harder for those cases to be brought. And even when they are brought, and courts have ordered the state to redraw a map, sometimes that map is then challenged again, like it was in Louisiana, where a court said, hey, Louisiana, you need to redraw this map to add a second Black congressional district in Louisiana. The name of that case is Louisiana versus Calais. And the legislature redrew a map with a second congressional district, but then non-white voters challenged that map as a racial gerrymander, meaning that they challenged the way the map was drawn because, in their opinion, the map was drawn with race being the predominant factor, meaning that these maps were drawn with race in mind. And that was true. That is true. These maps were drawn with race in mind because that is required under the Voting Rights Act. You can't comply with the Voting Rights Act if you don't take in consideration race. And so the court heard argument in the last session, the Supreme Court heard argument last session, but then it decided to punt that case to the next session, to rehear it again, next section, with a broader question. And that broader question is whether or not compliance with Section 2 violates the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And if Justice Thomas has his way, nobody will be able to bring Section 2 claims anymore under the Voting Rights Act, which will demolish our protections under the Voting Rights Act. I bring those legal updates up and I talk about them to note that this is why having an accurate count for the census is important. Having the ACS data and allowing us to prepare for the census fights, because our only claim in the future may be malapportionment claims. Like that may be our only recourse in challenging these maps if the courts demolish Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, if they destroy racial gerrymandering jurisprudence, and if intentional discrimination claims are harder to bring. Apportionment claims may be our only way to challenge these maps. And so that's why we need an accurate census. But another legal update that I want to note is that right now there's a case pending out of Louisiana where Louisiana, Kansas, Ohio, and West Virginia are trying to add a citizenship question to the census, because in their opinion, in those states' opinion, only citizens should be counted in the census. And if that is the case, that's going to lead to an undercount in many districts, in many states across the country, especially those who have huge undocumented populations. It's going to lead to an undercount and an underrepresentation in those districts. And this question is a dangerous one. It was one that was brought up in 2020, and the Supreme Court at the time struck down that question, said you could not add the question to the census because the government's reasoning for wanting that citizenship question was dubious. And so that was struck down last time, but it may not be struck down this time. The court has changed composition, and they may go along with it. The Supreme Court and other federal courts have seemed to agree with what Trump is doing, and that he has the power to do whatever he's doing. And so that's something that we need to be on the lookout as well, because if we have a citizenship question, again, there's going to be undercounts and underrepresentation in many of our states in the South. And then the last thing I want to raise is just the phenomenon of something called prison gerrymandering. So prison gerrymandering it's not in the courts. It's more so a policy question of how a state counts those people who are in prison or in jail. And prison gerrymandering in many states means that a person who's incarcerated is counted where they're incarcerated, not where they live. And what that does is it destroys communities, because those communities where people are from, incarcerated people are undercounted, essentially, because while a person may be a resident of that particular address in that particular jurisdiction, they are undercounted because they're not counted where they live. And so those numbers are inaccurate, I will say. And the same thing goes for where the prisons and jails are. Those numbers are overinflated because you have a group of individuals that don't have the right to vote, but are counted in that district. And so the people who live in that district around that jail or prison have a lot more power in those districts than they do in others, and then other people have in other districts. And that's a policy issue that we have to address. That's also going on behind the scenes of a lot of the redistricting lawsuits and redistricting advocacy that we're doing. But I'll close with this statement that we have to keep an eye on the courts, but the courts are not going to be our savior. We have to continue to educate ourselves about what it means to redraw districts, what it means to use the census data to create power through redistricting and through electing representatives that are going to represent us. And so we hope that we have an accurate census, and we hope that every effort is taken to ensure the accuracy of that census. And I'll turn it back over to Anisha.
And at this time, I want to switch to something that I believe we really need to focus on also, which is narrative, the role that narrative and messaging plays, right? How do we talk about the census in a way that actually moves our people? I always point out that data necessarily doesn't move people. It's the stories, right? It's the messaging that does. And we can give out the facts and the figures to explain what's at stake, but it is the narrative that really helps people see themselves in this work. And then I often say that narrative and messaging is more than just outreach. It is a form of organizing. It really frames the problem and lifts up what is possible. And it also affirms folks. It affirms that our communities are not only worthy of being counted, but essentially they are essential in shaping the future. And in communities that have been historically overlooked, ignored, intentionally excluded, the way we talk about the census and the way we talk about the American Community Survey, the way we talk about redistricting can either reinforce mistrust or it can build a bridge towards participation and power. Getting the message right that's just not a luxury that we have to play around with. It is a necessity. We have to get the message right. And I want to make a point. Mitch talked about the undercount, right? And I want to make a point that talked about what's at stake with these cases and being undercounted and why the census is so important. And being undercounted, this is not like accidental. It really benefits those in power who rely on our invisibility to maintain the status quo, the current power structures. And when our communities are missing from the data, it becomes easier to justify underfunding. It becomes easier to justify political neglect. It becomes easier to justify gerrymandering. And then we see disinformation is increasingly being weaponized to make people afraid of participating, especially in Black and Brown and other immigrant and low-income communities. And we see the conspiracy theories, social media, misinfo and disinfo, and even targeted political messaging that's aimed at confusing or deterring communities from completing or participating in these type of activities. And I want to name that these tactics aren't new, but they are evolving. And our messaging really has to evolve with them. And that's why intentional message testing, community-informed narrative work is one of the greatest defenses against this type of erasure that we're seeing. And as part of the Down for the Count narrative initiative, we launched a couple of things. We conducted an audience understanding survey and research with over 500 Alabamians, where we asked participants, what do they believe or what do they know about the ACS and census? Ask them what were their fears, what would help them trust the process. And here's what we found. We found that people do believe being counted is connected some kind of way to getting resources. I heard many folks repeating, if we're not counted, we get left out. We hear that, but the fears were real. The fears about privacy, data misusage, the mistrust in the system. And so what we did, we tested different message frames, each grounded in a specific emotion or values and lived experiences that surfaced during the audience research. So we tested different message frames, each related to or grounded in a specific values or emotion or lived experience that surfaced or that came out of the audience understanding research. And so we identified 5 frames, which was one was the motivational frame. And that frame pretty much emphasized the positive outcomes and the collective strength that comes from completing the census. This was really designed to emote like pride and help people think about what is possible by showing how participation directly benefits our communities. And so the example of that frame was a message within that frame was when we speak up through the census, our communities get seen and supported. So we really try to reframe participation as a source of community strength and visibility. The next frame that we tested was a relatable frame, a frame that spoke everyday language, just plain English, not industry standard technical language, just the kind that people use every day at the kitchen table. And so we found that it is effective for cutting through the jargon, the tech speaking, really connecting census participation to basic daily life. And I used this frame earlier in the conversation. A message was, hey, they always count us out. This is how we count ourselves in. And that's validating the longstanding exclusion while also offering a path forward. We also looked at a frame that addressed the mistrust. And so this frame, it did not shy away from the skepticism. Like instead, it acknowledges it directly. And so we tested messaging such as, you don't have to trust the system to know your community deserves better. This builds like the credibility, meeting people where they are emotionally, especially now in today's political climate, and particularly in historically underserved, underrepresented communities. And then we also tested the solidarity frame. This frame really expands the lens to include that collective responsibility. And it's not just about your neighbor, it's about ensuring no one is left behind. And we tested messaging such as every zip code matters to really appeal to those who believe in fairness and justice and in a shared investment in communities. And one frame that we decided to also test that we feel that folks really don't look at a lot is the whole civic responsibility frame. And this frame really targets the audience who responds to this being your social responsibility, your civic duty, right? Really resonating with people who already feel invested in democracy and who want to protect or improve existing systems, such as strong communities are built on real numbers. That was all about reinforcing the role that data plays in maintaining healthy and functioning communities. And so our hypothesis is that everyday community first language performs better than abstract appeals to this being your social responsibility. So messaging that really validates folks' fears and lived experiences and really pivots to empowerment lands best. And that's the power of narrative. And most importantly, I want to point out that this messaging should not live in a silo. Census in the ACS, messaging around those two tools must be fully interwoven into the broader civic engagement and civic education work. Whether we're talking about voter registration, mutual aid, community development, policy advocacy, to start interwoven messaging around the role that Census and the ACS plays. And when our messages about visibility and resources and power show up across all civic spaces, we begin to reinforce the understanding that these systems are interconnected. And the census is not this standalone issue, that it is foundational to so many others that we care about. I often say that no matter what issue you're working on, if you are not focusing on census and redistricting, then you are not building the type of power needed to address that issue. And by embedding our tested messaging into everyday civic touchpoints, whether it's through your local churches, community meetings, newsletters, PSAs on radio spots, or even neighborhood group chats, we can normalize participation and really build a culture where being counted is seen as both a right and a responsibility. And it's not just about filling out a form. I've moved away from that frame a long time ago. That the census is really about reinforcing, I guess, this worldview where our communities are recognized, especially when historically we have not been, right? And I want to pivot a little bit now that we understand the different messaging frames and strategies. I want to talk a little bit about like how do we turn this culturally relevant, this resonance that we're finding in like the messaging into real world application, real world actions. And that's where the folks on the ground come in. Because messaging doesn't end with a post or it doesn't end with a public service announcement. Narrative and messaging is most powerful when it's really, like I said, interwoven into the organizing, is interwoven into our institutions and our daily conversations. And so that is how narrative and messaging becomes culture. And then culture becomes change. I want to now explore how this work shows up in the field and the kind of tools and strategies that organizers are already using to bring the messages to life. And so with that, I am going to turn it over to Rusa and Carlos Torres to share how we turn narrative into organizing and just really talking about how folks can plug in locally. What tools are we building for leaders, organizers, neighborhoods? What does Hope at the Polls look like between now and 2030, Rodrisha? So you all, welcome to the stage, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you for having us.
Yes.
I'm glad to be on here with my comrade, Carlos, who is very educated on this topic as well. My name is Rodrisha Rusa. I am the Executive Director of TOPS, formerly known as the Ordinary People Society, headquartered in Dothan, Alabama, which is considered the Baptist bottom, the southeastern part of Alabama, where we directly work with marginalized communities and those that are highly impacted by homelessness and mass incarceration. And so some of these questions, Anisha, that you're asking and bringing forward, these are like the conversations that we are having on a daily with other partners and organizations such as HICA about the tools that we're using and how we're getting people involved. First, I would say just being a faith-based led organization, I think it's important to carve out the misinformation around what faith-based communities really do and to make sure that everybody understands that we have been known for the cornerstone of the community and been that beacon of hope for decades, for centuries. Matter of fact, anytime that there was a crisis or issue in the community, folks ran to the churches, whatever faith-based they practiced or whatever religion they practiced. So I don't think it was about whether you were Christian or whether you were Buddhist. It didn't really matter. I think people needed hope in their disparities. And so we're still here in 2025. And we're talking about the census data. Most of the people that are in our communities were in the churches. This is how we counted the census. And so now we're talking about, even in 2030, they're shifting the way that the census data is going to be collected, even to the part to where it's going to be modernized. And we know that folks that are coming from homeless backgrounds don't have a lot of access to the tools that they're going to be using to modernize this system. And by saying that access to Wi-Fi that is safe and security is secure. And so there's a question of cybersecurity. There's things that we're going to have to be looking for when it comes to how we're going to collect this data. And so tools is a very important conversation. Right now, what we are doing is we are continuing to have our radio station, which is 99.1 FM. Here in the Wiregrass, we are hosting public education shows. We know that a lot of people that, even if they don't have access to cell phones, they can hear those airwaves. It's just like newspapers. Back in the day, you used to throw those newspapers to the houses in your mailbox. And so even if you didn't have access to a phone, it was written documentation that made the way for us. And so nowadays, social media podcasts, everybody wants to have a podcast show. And the radio station is a huge tool where we have thousands of listeners tuning in to hear what our stakeholders are saying about census data, about voting, or anything that's pertaining to equal rights of our community. And how are we plugging them in? Soup kitchens. We have a soup kitchen that feeds over 300 people a day that works with not only just Black people, white people, minority folks. This is a whole conversation about our community of Latino that are directly impacted right now by our federal government. And we want to make sure that we are including every single voice. And so how are we plugging them in? Town hall meetings, Zoom calls, old school rallies, getting down, throwing down with the churches under the tent. Anything that we can do to bring hope. The question is, how do we bring hope to the polls? We have a campaign that is called Faith to Freedom. And on our Faith to Freedom campaign, we believe that we have to bring hope to the vote, before we can bring hope to the polls. And when you have people that worry about where their meals are coming from, their child care, how are they going to even afford Pampers? For God's sakes, we're not even just talking about the cost of milk anymore. We're talking about eggs. We're talking about a dozen of eggs that may only feed a family of four for maybe 2 days, right? So we're talking about a food crisis here. And in that, people are growing scared. And so we have to remember that we need to continue to empower and bring hope to people and provide them with direct services and let them know that we're not just here to count you in a census count. We're not here just to get you a part of the voting apparatus. We're here to restore you. We're here to increase your faith, that the community may not look like it may have looked 10 years ago, but organizers and advocates as myself and Carlos and these people and everybody that's on this live recording, that we are here to impart some part of hope to you. And so once we begin to really check on people, that's how we get them to the polls. That's how we bring hopes to the polls. And we have folks like us that are considered trusted leaders that will meet them on the day of elections and before the day of elections and after the day of elections to let them know that they are protected and they can be safe in this space. So those are some of the things that we're doing. Carlos, I definitely want to hear what you're doing because I love the work that y'all are doing throughout the state of Alabama.
Absolutely, Rodricha. I appreciate the conversation so far, and I appreciate the way you helped us understand that the campaign of Hope at the Polls, it's actually based on the natural need of all. I'll tell you, my name is Carlos Javier Torres. For those of you who are watching from home or listening to our conversation, I work at HICA, the Hispanic and Immigrant Center of Alabama, where I have been for the last 4 years. HICA has been in Birmingham for the last 26 years. We are a community development organization, and we champion economic equality, we champion social justice and civic engagement. On that piece of civic engagement, we know how crucial it is for people to find hope and find a way to transform that hope into action, to transform it into the steps that will take their feelings of helplessness to actually transform into, I can do something to change my own life and that of the people that I love and care for, those people in community. One thing, I want to take you back to the time when I was maybe 6 years old. I remember being at my grandma's house and sitting in the porch with the family. And I remember some workers from the community coming and knocking at our door and asking if they could ask a few questions. It turns out, I didn't know it back then. I was about 6 years old. It turned out that those were actually census workers. They were asking my mom and my grandmother about who lived in the house and explaining why that process was important. It isn't until I become an adult that I come to understand how crucial that counting process was. I had an opportunity to be counted at a time when, as a child, the resources that were coming to our community were dependent on that count. And I appreciated the fact that my mother and my grandmother were willing to share that information with others. That despite the fact that there's always concerns about what would any information that I share with others do? How would it be used? We know, and we are living in times that are different, and people are concerned and validly concerned about how their private information may be used. But I would also like to tell people at HICA, we do the work of civic engagement by sharing information that is power. Anisha said earlier, it is important that we share our narrative, we share our story. The storytelling piece of this is crucial. To be able to tell others that I can share my information and that process informs how our community is thriving or not thriving is crucial for me. I'll tell you also, the fact that people are fearful, it's not by coincidence. We do have powers, people that are trying to quiet down, to shade our voices in a tone that would not be heard. And that is because it is inconvenient for them to have voices of Black and brown people be heard. And so I recognize and I value the fact that as we tell our story and we share with others, that the story of each person makes a difference. We need to come not from a place of fear, but from a place of empowerment that requires that we find within ourselves the determination to speak up, whether people will listen or not. In most cases, when we speak up, people do listen. And that's where we have to claim our place in community. I'll tell you also that some of the things that we're trying to do are very basic. So when we talk about the census and how important it is to participate both at that decennial level, when the count happens every 10 years and every single person gets counted, every single person who lives and breathes in the United States on April the 1st of every decennial, which happens every 10 years. It happened the last time in 2020. The next one will be in 2030. You may think, or you may hear this and say, why are we talking about the census 5 years before it happens? We need to be talking about that because we need to get used to the idea that this process happens on a regular basis. We need to get used to the idea that children that are born today need to be counted in 5 years, because the next 10 years of their lives, when they will still be children, will depend in great measure in how they are counted or not, whether the resources that come for the schools or the local community organizations are brought into our community because we were counted. And Rodricia, you mentioned something. You mentioned that it is so important for people to look for hope and come together, for example, at churches, faith-based organizations. Why is that? There are two institutions that I feel and I truly recognize as pillars of our communities. That is those churches, those community-based organizations that are building on hope and providing a message of spirituality that bring people around the table or bring people to the pulpit to discuss what their faith may be. There's also the schools. And those are the other place in community where we need to, as parents, go and visit with the Parent-Teacher Association meetings, as they meet with other parents and discuss what they can do to improve the quality of the education that their children are getting. We need to also bring a message of how do we bring more resources in community. One of the ways that we can do it for sure is, number one, completing that census every time that count happens. There's another tool called the American Community Survey, what we call the ACS. That American Community Survey is actually regularly being conducted as a survey in different communities. People may get this invitation to participate, and they may not know if this is a valid tool or not, if they should participate in it or not. We need to make sure that people understand how important that is to participate. And Rodricia, I'm going to ask you, in terms of the types of groups that you interact with when you're working in community, what kind of community activities do you think are good for people to connect this message to?
So I would definitely say that, especially we work with a high population of formerly incarcerated people. And a lot of these people, as mentioned, have experienced prison gerrymandering, and they never felt like they were ever counted. And so some of the activities that we do is recovery cafes. We host group sessions, and we do events to empower them and to give them a sense of what family and community really looks like, to let them know that you may not felt like you were counted before while you were behind those bars or those gates, but you are counted now. And I think that is very important, especially the family of incarcerated children, and creating those programs, whether it be Bible study, old school Bible study, balloon pops, things like that, to remind them that no matter what you have gone through and you're being directly impacted by your family's incarceration, that you do belong as a citizen. And I believe that's the core of what census work should really be about.
That's fantastic. I appreciate that. I'll tell you that here at HICA, we are using very simple tools that we use on an everyday basis on our work. So we have our newsletter that we publish every month. We want people to subscribe to it because in that newsletter, we publish little articles that talk about issues like the census, like the American Community Survey, like any of the campaigns that we do for voter engagement. We have an election coming up in 2026. People showing up to the polls and making sure that they are registered before they show up to vote, that they actually do plan to go and vote and come out, show at the election day whenever there is that opportunity. I also want people to follow us on our Facebook page. I want people to actually subscribe to our Facebook page because that's where we publish information, resources, we share tools, we share news connected to, for example, the census. There is a plan that was just released by the Census Bureau of what the operations of the census will look like within the next 5 years. There's been a lot of planning that has been happening. There's already a plan that has been published as an opportunity for people to understand what to expect from it. Now, how do you and your community friends engage in that? I'll say, like I mentioned, follow us on Facebook, sign up for our newsletter, go into our website. And these resources, I'm talking about the ones that ICA uses. We have an Instagram account. We have an X, what used to be Twitter account that we publish on. I'm sure, Rodrigo, that you have similar social media tools that you use. Do you have any others that I haven't mentioned?
Yes, we have community magazines as well that we publish every single month. Radio, we do podcasts, we do all kinds of different things. So it just really depends on how it meets the needs. Yeah.
That's fantastic. And I think that we need to capitalize on sharing that opportunity for people. And then the other thing that I would ask in terms of the work that we're doing, trying to provide civic engagement tools, whenever any of you all who are listening to this, get an opportunity to talk to your friends and your family members and your coworkers, talk about the particular session that you listen to and say, hey, there's a link that you can click on and actually be able to continue to spread the word about how we can make this, democratize it, how we can make this information accessible to all people. I'll tell you, and with this I'll close, and we'll have Anisha join us momentarily so that we engage in a conversation with all of the panelists. But I'll tell you that there's another piece to this, and that is, how do we prepare to create the change that we want to see? We can only do that when we participate actively. I hear often from our constituents, and when we are in community, people who will tell us, I'm afraid that my voice doesn't count. I'm afraid that my vote doesn't count. I'm afraid that even if I participate, that's not making a difference. And the truth of the matter is that if we do not try, if we do not participate, we will never be able to see the impact of our participation. So with that, I'll invite Anisha to come back and join us, and hopefully we'll continue sharing how we can make our community better.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's see. And I think we're missing one other person, Mitch. Hey, Mitch. All right. So thank you all so much for sharing. And I think to really understand what's at stake in this next phase of census work, redistricting work, we have to really examine the structural and political landscape we're operating in. In 2025, we're already seeing federal shifts that will shape the 2030 count, from funding decisions to politicized proposals like reintroducing, Mitch, you talked about it, the citizenship question. And each of these shifts has deep implications, especially for communities that have long been undercounted and underrepresented. And we've also seen like the courts become battlegrounds for who gets counted and how. And in recent redistricting cases, the courts have responded to data and to organized community-led pressure. So we've seen that. But as Mitch mentioned, we can't always count on legal institutions to get it right, especially in a semi-weekend Voting Rights Act era. And that's why we need to be vigilant and prepared. And so I would love to have a conversation. Let's have a chat, y'all. And you just jump in where you see fit. But just really discussing around some of the questions around, based on the proposed changes that we're seeing to the census, like how might the courts respond, and what should we be watching for? Some of the changes that we talked about. Mitch, I think this would be a great question for you. Like, how might the courts respond? Or what should we be watching for right now? What should we be on high alert for?
Yeah, one of the things we should watch for is what the court will do with the citizenship question. That is a priority for this administration. And we can't assume that what happened in 2020 when the court struck it down, that they'll do it again this time, if it gets there. Like it could be stopped in its tracks. And that is something that we could push for. We can advocate for, that it's important to count everybody. And Anisha, you said it, that pressure from community members is going to be very important. And one of the things that I want to note is the court struck it down last time, but they struck it down not because they disagreed with it, but because they thought the reasoning behind it was dubious. And so that's very telling that if the government comes up with a better reason, they may agree with it this time. And then secondly, we've seen this administration try to finagle how districts are drawn. And imagine meshing a citizenship question with mid-cycle redistricting like we're seeing in Texas, where a letter from DOJ can spark a new session in Texas to use Black and brown people as pawns in a political game. And so meshing the citizenship question and redistricting and just the pressure, the political pressure that's being put on people, it really is going to impact voters of color. And we have to say something about that now.
Mitchell, I'll tell you, I appreciate what you just shared, because this issue with the citizenship question in the census it's not happening by coincidence. So in 2020, we had the same effort. There is a desire to disenfranchise communities that are Black and brown. One of the tools that they can use is to use this citizenship question as a fear-mongering tool, because people would be confused about whether or not they should be counted just because of the fact that they're asking for citizenship, even though the spirit of the law that establishes that we should count everybody every 10 years in the United States indicates that every person living in the United States on April the 1st, every time the census happens, needs to be counted. If you breathe in this land, regardless of whether you're a citizenship or not, you're supposed to be counted, because that's the way that we fairly represent what our communities look like. So we know that they are ready and trying to make an effort to disenfranchise us. We need to stay attentive. We need to pay attention to what the courts are doing. But even if the citizenship question were to be allowed to be in the census tool, in the census instrument, I want to make an invitation to all people out there, whether you're Black, brown, or white, to remember that regardless of the questions included, you can actually skip a particular question if you want to, but you need to still be counted. You need to still answer who and how many people live in that particular household. So these are things that I think that we need to demystify what the issues may be. We are at the mercy of what the courts will do and what the administration may do. We have an opportunity to talk about it, and we have an opportunity to come up and demand that our voices be heard, even as these decisions are being made. But even in light of those potential decisions that may not look like they would be good for us, we cannot be held back. We cannot be holding ourselves back from participating. And I'll stop there.
And Carlos, you make up a great point. And I think also some people may have missed the other point you made. You said that you can still skip a question and still complete the census. I think folks miss that. If we are being real, the push to reintroduce the citizenship question is not about data accuracy. It is about fear. It's about sending a message to immigrant communities, mixed status communities, that participating in the census isn't safe for them. And even the threat of that question, whether or not it ends up on the form or not, it can have a very chilling effect. And folks hear about it, they think, okay, I'm not risking it, and that fear sits in. And so it doesn't just lower response rates, it ripples through entire communities. When it does lower response rates, schools get underfunded, hospitals don't get what they need. In Alabama, we're experiencing a lot of hospital closures. And then when redistricting time comes, those communities are invisible on the map. And I think that's the point of doing this, right? And so I think it's important for us to demystify the process, to say things like, skip it. But I would just really hone in on the importance of filling out the census. So I don't know if we can just say skip it. So maybe we skip me saying that. But I think it's important for us to demystify.
Anisha, I'll tell you, in fact, I worked for the census in 2020 on the partnership side, not on the enumeration side. But the instructions for the census questions are that you try and provide as complete an answer as you can, but nobody's forced to answer any one particular question. And no surveyor is supposed to either discount you or treat you differently because you skip a question. So that's a right of somebody to actually decide not to participate in any one particular question.
All right, there we go. There you have it. So that is, and if I'm being fully transparent, that's something I did, something that will resonate with folks when we say, hey, look, this is still a tool that is connected to us building power and just explaining and validating their lived experiences and the mistrust that they have, but also saying, hey, this form says that you fill this out to the best of your ability. Yeah.
And I was going to say today, this is also a question about equity and inclusion. in its best form, because a lot of people, even now, African Americans don't identify. A lot of them don't identify as African Americans. They're going to put either you got to select black or white. And the thing about it is that I believe that people should have the right to identify whatever culture they believe they can. But what they're trying to do is separate those that are undocumented from those that are documented. And it is another way to target our communities. And you just have to call it what it is. And you hate to give out that narrative like you can skip the process, but anytime you don't feel comfortable in any type of application, you can do your due diligence and choose how you want to fill that out. And it does say fill out every question, but the main thing is it's the distrust. And we have to realize why those questions are there. Those questions, and this is access that goes to the federal government, you guys. Let's not forget that. This is the information that identify not only just you, but identify your family. And when you select that you are not a citizen, whatever, those are also included in your family members and those that are after you. And so we want to definitely look at that trajectory moving forward in the 2030 census count and how they're really thinking up top.
And I want to just highlight something Carlos said, because it slipped in, was that under the enumeration of the census and under the 14th Amendment and how the census is carried out and how apportionment is carried out, the citizenship question is not aligned with the Constitution, because, as Carlos said, it counts who's here. If you're breathing here, then you're to be counted in the census. And so any citizenship question, we can skip the question, but if somebody is either detained because they answer the citizenship question, if it comes up, we as legal advocates need to be prepared to protect these voters and protect these people, not even voters, protect these people, because that's not aligned with the Constitution. And that apportionment can't be, you can't change the apportionment formula or the apportionment law because you think that somebody's not a citizen. That's not what the Constitution says. And for those legal strategists who say we have to be faithful to the Constitution and the way the founders wrote it this way. So you trying to add it in there, it's actually a form of activism that you're complaining about.
Another thing, Anisha, that I wanted to bring to the attention that we really need to look forward to is the downsizing of the canvassing and also the modernizing of the technology. And the reason why I say that is because a lot of people still aren't aware, particularly in the state of Alabama, not all states, that people that have crimes that's not involving moral turpitude can still vote in and outside of prison. And I say that to say that people are still being counted in the prisons, even though they're being disproportionately counted, they can still be counted. And if they are to change over using data tracking for the census, in particularly like by mobile devices and so on, Alabama has a restriction on contrabands. So how are we thinking about the census data being collected inside of these prisons and jails where folks aren't going to catch another felony charge for using cell phones, and how in particular this is going to impact that population, because it's a very large population. Alabama, we are still one of the 5th states that has the highest incarceration rates. And then also I spoke a little bit earlier about the homeless population in general. I think like Carlos really brought up the fact that folks from the church, folks that were community leaders, these were the canvassers. These were the people that they trust. And now we're having to trust even more in a technology system where people are having to use to be counted, and they're not getting that face-to-face anymore. The preachers aren't able really to go into the jails like they used to register to vote, even though that was supposed to be part of the Alabama Department of Corrections. And so I wanted to highlight that this will make a big difference on how data is collected within the penal system. And we need to be thinking ahead on a larger scale. How will we be able to count folks? And we know they should be counted in their residence anyways, but this is a way to silence them participating in the census data.
Yes, and I think it's important, folks. We hear the term prison gerrymandering, but okay, for folks who may say, okay, I know what gerrymandering is. I'm assuming it's easy to understand what prison gerrymandering is, but I think it's important for folks to realize that prison gerrymandering, like in the most simplest definition I can give, is when folks who are incarcerated are counted in the place where the prison is, which is usually like a rural area, right? Instead of where they actually live and call home before they were locked up. So if someone is from, say, I don't know, Birmingham, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, or what have you, but they're serving time in a prison out somewhere, out from where they're from, they're being counted in that rural town, like not back home, their own neighborhood. And so why is this important? Those rural areas get a population boost, even though the people in prison can't vote and aren't really part of that community, while the neighborhoods they came from in funding is like our communities are being stripped apart for parts. And I think it's important to point out that when it's time to redraw redistricting maps, voting maps, it means that the places locking folks up are gaining influence while the communities mostly impacted by mass incarceration are being silenced again. And so this is why fixing prison gerrymandering matters. Like it's really about counting people where they're truly from, where their families are, where their schools are, and communities are still feeling their absence. And so it's really about making sure that our people show up in the data where it counts. Because if we don't, then I want to make it, I just want to name that the system will keep stealing our power while locking up our people.
You know, I'm sorry, Mitchell. The amazing thing about that is that we have to realize that the urban communities are the ones that are greatly impacted by that. And it's actually skewing the data. Because if they're being counted in the prison, it's taken away from the count in the urban areas, which is considered their homes. It's considered where their family lives. And so that creates a whole nother enhanced representation of the prison. And so most people are looking like they're in prison, so it doesn't matter who's counted over there. No, it's taking away the vote from the district. It's taking away the census data from the urban communities. And so it's still disproportional.
And the one thing I'll add is that the states and even the counties don't have to count these people where they are. Like that is not a legal requirement that because you're incarcerated somewhere different than your residence, you have to be counted there. That is not a legal thing. States and counties can say, I'm going to count you where you reside because they had the information. Because guess what? When you leave prison or jail, they're going to ask you, where's your residence? Where are you going back to? So they have that information already. So it's not even hard thing to count them where they last resided. But I just wanted to note that fact that it's not, you don't have to count them there. You can count them back home.
Yeah. And I think we named something too when we think about Black and brown communities are the most impacted by the justice system. Historically, they have been disproportionately impacted, and that continues to happen. So correcting prison gerrymandering isn't just like this technical fix or what have you. It is a justice issue. It's just making sure people are being counted where they belong. Like I said, where their families live. And like I said, yeah.
Yeah, and if we have more funding that's going to be taken away out of the field operations of traditional way, we're going to have a large issue in the counts. We're talking about doing self responses. A lot of people can't file their taxes. We have to look at, we're going to need some real innovation, creatively, culturally speaking, to make sure everybody's counted.
Yes. And so speaking of voting, like redistricting maps and census connection to that and voting rights, I want to put the question out there as we think about the rollback and like voting rights protection. Like, what do you believe is most at risk for communities of color, and what organizing strategies should we be thinking about leaning into as we think about protecting fair representation and making sure folks get out the count?
Let me take a stab at that question, and I'll try to keep it very short. I would ask in terms of how does all of these affect us? And what can we do? If I were to ask anybody listening to this recording, is every time you're in front of that polling booth, you're about to make your vote or to give your vote. Every time you have this survey from the American Community Survey in your hands and you're deciding whether to complete it or not, or when you have somebody knocking on your door to ask that you complete the census, ask yourself, is what I am doing, is my action against my own interest, or are my actions going to be for the interest of me and the people that I love? That's the question that I want you, every single one of you, to ask yourself. Is the action that I'm taking against my own interest and that of the people that I love? Because if you're not answering the census, if you're not completing it, if you're not going and exercising your right to vote, if you're not making your voice heard, that's all against your personal interest. Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you, Carlos. And Mitch, I know you have to hop. So, Mitch, I just wanted to, could you chime in, especially as we talk about rollbacks to VRA, right? We're seeing gains and we're seeing wins. We're seeing potentially Alabama may be put back on the pre-clearance, which may be beneficial for others. But then we're also seeing, so can you just chime in and talk about how this swing may impact, could positively have a positive impact or negative impact?
Yeah. So if Alabama's put back under pre-clearance, that's going to be very helpful in showing that courts will uphold the rule of law. So under the Voting Rights Act, everybody talks about Section 2 and Section 5. And Section 5 was the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act. But there is Section 3 of the Voting Rights Act, which includes what we call I learned in law school as a pocket trigger, but it is a pre-clearance mechanism that if a state has violated the 14th or 15th Amendment by intentionally discriminating against voters, that a court can place them back under pre-clearance for a limited amount of time. And so if Alabama's placed back under that, then it may open up the floodgates for other states who have discriminated against Black voters, i.e. North Carolina, Texas, to be placed under pre-clearance as well if they violate the 14th and or 15th Amendment again. So that's one swing. The other swing is the Voting Rights Act may not be a reality after the next Supreme Court session, depending on what the Supreme Court does with whether or not Section 2 can be used to bring redistricting cases. So it is very possible that in the 2030 and after 2030 census and the 2031 redistricting cycle, we don't have many protections for redistricting. And so states will be allowed to draw any type of partisan map that they want to, with very limited recourse for people to challenge those maps. However, one thing I always want to note to people is that the more we get people out to vote, it flips the narrative and the redistricting context on its head, because redistricting is based on projections. When a legislature draws a map, they are drawing a map saying that based on previous elections, X number of people will vote for this person, and X number of people will vote for this person. But that's based off those projections. That's not based on 100% turnout. If we increase turnout to 70, 80%, then those projections go out the window because they're based off of a turnout number of 50% from previous elections. So the more we turn out people and get them educated about why it's important to vote, to Carlos's point, and why it's important to be engaged, that's going to change this redistricting narrative. The more people we get to fill out the census, the more representation we can fight for in the legislature and in the courts. And so while we have this swing of whether or not we're going to be protected by the Voting Rights Act or by the Constitution, we still have an opportunity to flip the narrative on its head by making sure that we get out to vote.
Thank you, Mitch. And then I want to pose to the closing question to Rajisha and Carlos. So what is one action that you want every viewer to take after watching this discussion, right? What is giving you hope right now in the fight?
One action that you can take definitely is to get more involved in the census process. And I mean that by saying, become more educated about what the census is and what that means, not just for you, but also for your family. Plug in with organizations such as Alabama Values and HICA and all the organizations you've seen on here so that you can know what's going on and share that knowledge as well. And I'm hopeful that we are turning things around. You've seen in Alabama, we have won that redistricting fight. We are still fighting through some things. Louisiana won the fight, and it is making a wave across the country, starting off with the South. And I am hopeful that things, even though we see challenges in Texas, I'm hopeful that things are going to definitely straighten out, and you just have to continue to have your faith and believe that as we stay educated. My mom always says, if you don't want to know something, don't open a book. So read your text, become knowledgeable and informed so that you know how to combat all these obstacles to making sure that you are counted.
Thank you. And Carlos, I'll turn it over to you.
I'll say, I think the opportunity that we have in front of us is reflected by this panel. And what I mean by that is, if I were to ask anybody to do something, it would be work in coalition. Whenever you hear people talk about, I belong to this coalition or I belong to that other coalition, ask what the coalition is and whether or not it would be a place for you to contribute, because it takes a village. It will sound trite, but it really takes a village. We need to work together. Coalitions can move mountains, and that is because it brings the best of each one of us to a group that is trying to put forward progress. And that, I think, would be my call to all people listening to this. And if you're telling everybody or anybody about what you listened and you heard and what you saw here, please work in coalition and repeat the story so that others can do the same.
Thank you. Thank you. And everything that we've talked about today, from the intentional disinformation campaigns to leveraging the power of trusted messengers, from different messaging frames to tools for action and community organizing, has one through line, right? Which is our visibility determines our power. And the census, along with the ACS and redistricting, is one of the few tools that we have that can turn our presence into policy. It can turn our people power into political power. And we've seen the connections made through the redistricting cases that we're seeing across the South, whether it's Alabama, Louisiana. Rodrigo, I know you just mentioned those, when fair maps were fought and won, in part because communities showed up in the data. And then they also showed up in people power. And when we speak in language that resonates, language that is rooted in the culture, the trust, and the lived experiences, like, we are not just driving participation, we are really affirming that our communities have the right to shape their futures, and that this is not about complying to a civic activity. This is about our freedom and liberation. And that is really about replacing the invisibility that has historically plagued our communities with presence. We are here, right? And replacing the extraction that we often see with investments. And then also this erasure that is happening, that isn't new, by the way, this erasure with the truth, with the stories that live, that are embedded within these communities. And I believe that this kind of work, the work that we're doing, like you pointed out, Carlos, and also just the narrative work that we're doing, is about helping our communities really reimagine and step into a world where they are no longer pushed into the margins, but they are centered in the vision of their future. They're the decision makers, they're the builders, they're holding the collective power. And I just want to just thank our panelists and everyone that joined us. And I do want to close out with just some closing actions, right? I encourage folks, become a messenger. You don't have to be an expert. Talk to your family, talk to your neighbors, talk to your congregation. If you have a mic like Rodrigo, talk to your online communities and talk about this, right? Integrate census, education, and information also into your civic work for those who are advocates and community organizations, whether you're registering voters or running a food pantry or planning a town hall. Make census and ACS and redistricting part of the conversation. And then also join our campaign. Visit downforthecount.org and just join us as we build towards 2030. Like, we're doing that now. And that includes trainings and conversations and toolkits and volunteer opportunities. And I said it earlier, but I'll say it again because it's true, that they may always count us out, but this is how we count ourselves in. And so thank you for being down for the count. Let's get to work.